Thank you. I'm going to be very informal, if you don't mind, ladies and gentlemen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Because I'll wander around, you know, just happens to me. I don't give this speech very often. Usually only when there is a very friendly audience, because some of these memories are still painful, even to this day. Now, it won't be all about the Holocaust, so that will be a bit much. But I will start at the beginning. The curtain rises on March 13th, 1938. You were born, Kim, weren't you, Tim?
Not yet.
What?
Not yet. He wasn't born yet in 38.
I can't believe this guy. You know. He must have taken love potions of some kind, the two of them, this couple here, to look so young. Yeah.
Professor, it's a little hard to hear.
All right. I thought I had a mic somewhere in my body. Well, so I should speak louder, right? Is that better now?
Yes.
Good. So we'll talk louder. All right. March 13th, 1938 was when Adolf Hitler took over Austria, my homeland. And I'll never, ever forget that day. Because on that particular day, I was alone with, if you pardon the expression, my governess. Back in old Europe, nice little boys and girls had governesses when their parents had to go someplace else. They didn't want to leave them alone. Whoops.
It's okay.
What is this? What are you drinking here?
Water.
Vodka. No, just kidding. Better not be.
That's okay. Go on drinking. You got some nice cookies here too, right?
No, granola bars. Sort of.
She has to explain herself. Okay. It's okay. Don't worry about it. All right. Now, I was a 10-year-old brat then, in 1938. But I also felt that something was not right with Vienna. Because before Hitler, Vienna was the capital of Europe when it came to the arts and music. It was a beautiful city. You know, there was Mozart, there was Schubert, there was Beethoven, and I grew up with them. My parents took me to concerts, and all this changed in one terrible hour. So I was in the care of a governess whose name was Liesel. Liesel is short in Austrian, which is the same as German, except it's different pronunciations. It's short for Elizabeth. Liesel, L-I-S-L. I called her Liesel. And that particular day, all schools were closed in Vienna. And the city was decked out with thousands of swastika flags. You know the swastika, the hooked cross, which was the Nazi flag. And Liesel, I remember, said to me, Hansi, which was my boyhood name, my childhood name, a diminutive of Hans, which means John, and which I later translated to John when I came to the United States. So she said, Hansi, would you like to see the Führer? Now we know who the Führer was. Führer was Adolf Hitler. He called himself the Führer, and all of Germany referred to him only as the Führer, which means leader in German. Now, Hitler's victory parade was leading through the Ringstraße. The Ringstraße was a circular boulevard which embraced Vienna. And Hitler wanted to have maximum visibility as he took over Austria on that day. And it so happened that Liesel and I came out on the other side of the Ringstraße and then stood on a very small hill where we could look down on the rest of the Ringstraße. And I had never been to that part of the city before. It was something that I had never done. Although my mother, she liked to walk a lot. And she took me for long walks. And on one of these walks, I remember, we passed up the Berggasse. The Berggasse was famous for ice cream sodas, but also for a famous Viennese whose name was Sigmund Freud. I assume all of you heard about Sigmund Freud. Nobody knew him then. And I remember I asked my mother, why is his name Freud? Which means Freude is joy. And my mother said, I don't know why he's called Freud, but I know that there is a word Freude, and you know who composed that symphony in which there's a chorale? Andi Freude called the Ode to Joy. That's how I first learned the Ode to Joy, which I still like to sing when I'm in a good mood. I might even do it here. I have no idea. It just happens. Well, we looked down from that hill, and when I looked down the hill, I saw 3 or 4 motorcyclists with the armband of the SS. Now the SS were the worst of the Nazi murderers, with the swastika armbands. And they slowly set themselves in motion and roared up the hill. And behind them was a completely new Mercedes convertible, and in it stood upright the Führer, as they called him. Adolf Hitler was standing in the car doing the famous Nazi salute. And then, as this car approached Liesel and me, for some inexplicable reason which I don't understand to this day, Hitler's car came to a complete stop a few meters away from Liesel and me. And then something very strange happened. Liesel let go of my hand. She was a devout Catholic. Austria was a Catholic country, and she always wore a crucifix between her breasts, and she tore off the crucifix and threw it away. And said hoarsely under her breath, she said, "Holy Maria, Mother of God, this is the new Messiah." It sounds worse in German. Heilige Mutter Gottes, das ist der neue Messias. Now, being a 10-year-old kid, I didn't understand the ramifications of this, of course. I was much too young to realize what that meant. What it meant was that Hitler had this charisma. It was an evil charisma. All of you know what a charisma is, right? Something is charismatic. It means it's powerful, more than powerful. He had this powerful, evil charisma. That made most people in Germany totally loyal to him. Personally, they all had to take an oath, the famous Hitler oath. There was a Hitler Youth. Already all over Austria. And the sad thing of it was that Austria was never the same. after Hitler. I went back there quite recently, and it's not part of the European Union, of course, as everybody knows. But they still like to deny, and that really gets me mad. They still like to deny that they joined up with Germany voluntarily. Well, they didn't put up a fight. So it was pretty obvious that they did. And Hitler counted on it. Well, that day, I was uneasy. I didn't really know why. But something in me told me that there was disaster in the making, even as a 10-year-old kid. Well, I just didn't want to be alone that evening. So I asked Liesel whether she could stay and fix us both some dinner, and maybe then play some four-handed Mozart on our Bösendorfer piano, which is a great Austrian piano, which is very valuable to this day. And she said no, she couldn't. She said she had an appointment with a friend. Well, I fixed myself something to eat, and then went to bed and fell into a fitful sleep. I couldn't sleep well. And somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up because I heard whispering in my parents' bedroom, which was separated from my little room by a velvet curtain. They had these old-fashioned velvet curtains in those days, which you could look over. And I was scared, because who was whispering? So I got out of my little bed and tiptoed over to the curtain and lifted it so I could look into my parents' bedroom, and saw an absolutely ghastly sight. There was Liesel, my governess. Sitting upright in my parents' bed, completely nude, and clutching to herself the body of a very large man. And I saw on the carpet an SS uniform and a swastika armband. So I saw this dreadful sight. For me it was dreadful, because Liesel, on whom I had a mad crush, was making love to a member of the SS. Now, to a 10-year-old kid, that's catastrophic. That was the first thing that caused me terrible pains. But that was not even enough, because what she whispered to him was worse. She said, why don't you stay a while? Give me a son for the Führer. Now you all can figure out what that meant, right? It was this, give me a son for the Führer. Gib mir einen Sohn für den Führer. It sounded horrible. And it made me wild with pain. I mean, I know I was 10 years old, and I had a big attack of puppy love. I had a mad crush on Liesel. So I find this whole thing was aimed at me. She wanted a son for the Führer. Well, I developed a high fever. My parents, my mother, and my father had been on a short summer vacation in Prague, Czechoslovakia, where my grandparents lived, which was only about five hours by train from Vienna. And when they came back, my mother promptly fired Liesel and said, we're leaving Vienna tomorrow. She was a good mother, because Czechoslovakia was the only real democracy in Eastern Europe in those days. And it was a free country. So remember, we took that train to Prague. Now my grandparents I loved my grandparents very deeply. They spoiled me rotten. I was their only grandchild. They took walks with me in the woods surrounding Prague, where I picked blueberries in the woods. And then my grandma would make blueberry jam out of it. And would give me a large 5-crown piece, which was quite a lot of money. And then I ate the blueberry stuff after having pocketed the 5-crown piece. They spoiled me. Well, Prague was a beautiful city. It is to this day probably the most beautiful city in Europe still. But in those distant days, it was more than that. It was a democracy. The president of Czechoslovakia was Thomas Masaryk, who was a very close friend to the American president at the time, who was Woodrow Wilson. How many have heard of Woodrow Wilson? That's right, they were close friends. It was beautiful. I learned the Czech language, which I speak to this day. I think one has to be born with that language. There are some sentences which have nothing but consonants, not a single vowel. Yeah, like strch, prs, krs, krk. That's a sentence in Czech. Anyone here from what they call today the Czech Republic? Well, my God, how distant that is. Well, I went to a Czech school. I made new Czech friends. Clearly, I learned the language. But then something terrible happened. Adolf Hitler had developed, obviously, a passion to follow me around. Because he annexed Czechoslovakia, as you probably know from your history classes, right? In 1939, there was this big powwow with Neville Chamberlain, who said, "Peace in our time." That's because Hitler had promised him that he would not annex Czechoslovakia. Well, of course, he lied as usual. He was the expert in the great lie. It was another bloodless victory. Because how could small Czechoslovakia stand up against the tanks of the Third Reich? And I remember that day when I stood on St. Wenceslaus Square, which was the main plaza in the Czech capital in Prague. And our Hitler's tanks rounded the corner, and how about 50 elderly women threw themselves on the cobblestones, face down, as a final protest against this rape of Czechoslovakia. And the Nazi tanks didn't stop. They fired their guns into the midst of these poor women. And 20 women or so could not get up anymore. They were mortally wounded or dead. Why does it bring to mind, of course, this horrible thing that happened yesterday in Boston? Something like that. Nobody still knows. But this, thank God, is the United States, and they're going to find out. This is not Nazi Germany. And thank God this is remote history now. Well, it was not long before Hitler annexed not just the Sudeten area, but all of Czechoslovakia. And he made a gift, so he said in German, to the Czechs by sending to Prague, the capital, a mass murderer whose name was Reinhard Heydrich. Heydrich was a monster. He was the first to suggest to Hitler, his boss, he said, "Mein Führer, I have a recommendation to make. It is not enough to kick out the Jews. we should exterminate them. Before Heydrich, nobody even thought about gas chambers. But Heydrich started them. The first ones were there were some, very few, in Dachau, in Germany, in Buchenwald. Those are the main concentration camps in Germany. But the really horrible ones that everybody remembers to this day who was even near those places was Auschwitz in Poland and Treblinka in Poland. And it was at that point that my poor father couldn't stand it anymore. And in a moment of terror, he committed suicide. Now, by this time I was 13, but there was no time for bar mitzvahs. My mother had grieved for 2 or 3 years, and then began to see a gentleman whose name was Oskar Stoessinger, and he became my stepfather. He not only married my mother, but he adopted me. My original name was Hans Hirschfeld. So, and Oskar Stoessinger, he knew what he was doing. He said to my mother, "We have to leave Europe. It'll only get worse." But my poor mother didn't know what to do. Have any of you seen the movie or read the book Sophie's Choice? Yeah, it's a great film, a great book. And my mother confronted this. She had 2 choices. She could cast her lot with her new husband and me on the one hand, or she could stay behind with her parents, my grandparents, whom I loved, to a very uncertain fate, because we did not know yet about the gas chambers. And she cast her lot with her husband and her son. But the reason why it's called a Sophie's Choice is, no matter what you choose, you will probably lose your mind because of the pain involved. And that's exactly what happened to my poor mother. We now had to apply for visas, exit visas, entry visas, endless paperworks, because our passports that we had were stamped ungültig, which means invalid, with a big swastika in it, stamped by a Nazi official. So we couldn't travel on these passports. So after my mother had made up her mind, to leave Europe, all of Europe, with her husband and with me. That was another terrible day. Saying goodbye to my grandparents, whom I loved. I still remember the train in the station, huffing and puffing and taking on coal. In those days, the trains ran on coal. And my poor mother was hugging her father, my grandfather. And when I saw this, I went crazy. I can only say I went nuts and crazy. It was too awful. Because something in me told me that I was seeing the last of my grandparents. No more blueberries, no more walks up the hill. And that's indeed what happened. And I don't want to give you even more pain like this. We left Prague by train. And when I saw these hugs, these goodbye hugs, I went crazy. And I shouted and yelled, I don't want to go, I don't want to go. I want to stay here with you, I said in my grandmother's arms. And my grandpa picked me up bodily, and the compartment window was still open, and actually picked me up and passed me through that window. And my mother pulled me in and put me next to her on a seat. And then the only thing I saw when I looked back was my grandfather sort of walking slowly with a train. Walking slowly with the train, and then waving a flashlight up and down, up and down. And that was the last I saw of them. Exactly 1 year later, my poor grandparents perished in the gas chambers of Treblinka in Poland, where they were deported to by the Nazis. That is why I dedicated the 11th edition of my book, Why Nations Go to War, to the memory of my grandparents. That's all I could do, and I had to do it 50 years later. And people ask me, why did you do that? And then I explain it to them. All right, I think I've depressed you enough, right? Well, now comes an interesting episode of my Holocaust years. Because we made, thanks to my stepfather, we made our escape. And indeed, we did it just in time. First, we took the... Do I step on something here?
We're miking you.
What?
We're
putting
gonna
a
get you another
microphone on
microphone, so you don't have to speak so loudly.
Oh, I don't mind. Yeah. I think there was I thought it was some sort of a protest.
No, accolades, not protest.
You got a wonderful professor here in Teresa. I call her, I can't help it, I have to call her by her first name.
Yes.
Testing.
Not to mention her husband, who claims I don't know how old he is, but he says he's got a 20-year-old daughter.
29.
29. Do you want to get up a minute?
I'm good.
I know you're good, otherwise you wouldn't be here. Okay. So now, we had to ask for visas. Oh, do I really need
Speak into
this
that?
thing?
Yeah, well.
No.
They think that you do.
They think? Okay, then I give in. Okay. All right, very good. We had to ask for visas now in Prague. But nobody wanted the Jews. And the only consul who gave us visas, can anybody guess which consul gave us visas from which country?
Mexico.
What?
Mexico.
Mexico. Wrong.
Russia?
Wrong answer.
Russia.
Wrong answer.
Wish.
No, I wish. No, we couldn't get visas to the United States because there was a quota number which was oversubscribed by 50 years, so we didn't want to wait that long to die in a concentration camp.
France?
What?
France?
France?
Venezuela.
No.
Scotland.
France was where my friend and colleague, has anyone heard of Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor and poet laureate and Nobel Peace Prize winner? Yeah. Yeah.
Switzerland?
Good guess, but wrong again.
Netherlands?
Nope.
Greenland.
No.
Ireland.
Norway? China?
Get on your feet. Yeah, you said the right answer. You have to be rewarded. China. Now, I'm not surprised it took that long, right? Because who would guess, possibly, that 3 Jewish people who spent all their lives in Western Europe, living good lives, would have to go to a place called China? I remember I asked my stepfather, are we really going to China? Which city are we going to? And the answer was Shanghai, China. Shanghai, China. So I said, I burst into tears and I start crying and I said, we might as well go to planet Mars. I thought that was a joke, but it wasn't. So we took the train to the trip from Prague to Moscow, which was an overnight train. And I looked out the window in the middle of the night. There was a full moon out. and we crossed a country that no longer existed. Which country was that? You guys didn't know this was a test. You're going to get graded on this. Okay, forget about it. Yeah. Poland, which Hitler and Stalin had divided between them in the famous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And I remember in Moscow, we had to change trains to what was known as the Trans-Siberian Express, which took approximately 3 months to cross all of Russia, plus Siberia. That's why it was called the Trans-Siberian Express. And we bought tickets on it, and indeed that's exactly what it took. It was quite a journey. I remember it very well, because I was sitting at the window. I couldn't sleep. I missed my grandparents too much. I looked over the vast horizon. The enormous countryside, the full moon, and every dawn, the northern lights, what they call the Aurora Borealis. It was beautiful. Except we didn't know quite where we should get off. We didn't know that country. Russia was a huge country. Of course, then it was called the Soviet Union. Soon it was not to be. And then we arrived in Shanghai. The arrival in Shanghai was, to put it mildly, very anticlimactic for me. You know, we had vaguely heard of China, except China was a place that was in fairy tales. I remember I read a little book about China, which is a picture book, and you saw what the old Chinese did. You know, it was all sort of a fairy tale book. Well, the fairy tale turned out to not to be a fairy tale, because the first thing we saw when the ship, when I forgot to mention that we had to take a little ship, a steamer, and we got off in Vladivostok, which was the end of the run of the Trans-Siberian Express. And when it was on a clear day, you could look across the Bering Strait and see Alaska, which was then a territory. So we got off on the docks of Shanghai. The first thing I saw was a half-naked coolie with a bamboo hat, schlepping behind him a vehicle which they called a rickshaw. And in the rickshaw sat a very obese woman who yelled in Chinese, "Go faster, go faster." I said, what sort of work is this? You have to make your living here, pulling a rickshaw, I said to myself. What is this place? But then my stepfather was a very resolute man. He actually got himself a small job as a teller in one of the branches of the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, which was a huge bank. And we discovered there were very rich people in Shanghai living there who had amassed fortunes. Among them were the Kaduris, the Sassoons, names that are even familiar here today. They lived in Shanghai and made their fortunes there. It was an easy place to become rich. You just would have to do what you could. They played a stock market, they gambled, they went to horse races, all kinds of stuff like that was in Shanghai. And my stepfather got somewhat ill, and my mother now took over. My mother decided to become a milliner. A milliner is a hat maker. She made hats for elderly Jewish ladies who had preceded us and who would pay the prices that my mother charged. She was quite able to make a living, to step in for my stepfather. And with these newly found funds that she had, she was able to inscribe me in an excellent British public school. We found out one thing when we got there, that Shanghai, was a divided city. Mind you, this was still the era of colonialism, where the Western powers all had colonies. Britain, France, Belgium were only some of them. And accordingly, the city was divided. There was a British Queen Victoria Boulevard, which celebrated the old Queen Victoria. They're burying today another great British Prime Minister. Who is that? Margaret Thatcher. There is a burial today, a burial ceremony, which will no doubt be on TV. I'll come to that a little later. Margaret Thatcher permitted a handful of Jews to find rescue in England, but not very many. Among those few was a man by the name of Sigmund Freud. He went to England and practiced there. But unfortunately, he died a year later, at the age of 88. But now there was another problem. You see, there was always problems upon problems. there was also a French concession which literally belonged to France. I just forgot this. And that's where we had a little walk-up place. We lived in the French concession. The street names were named there after incompetent generals from World War I, like Avenue Foch, Avenue Pétain, Avenue this, Avenue that. That was a French concession. But then came the disaster. The disaster was Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was a complete disaster. It was a disaster for the United States because of the sneak attack. Many, many people, even in Honolulu, perished from the sneak attack. But now, the Japanese occupied Shanghai. Tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers marched into Shanghai. And in 1943, in the middle of the war, the Tojo regime, the militarists in Japan, passed an edict that all refugees from Europe who had arrived after 1936 would have to go to a Jewish ghetto. It was never enough, you know. Here we thought we had gotten away from Hitler to the other end of the world, and we were still under Hitler's thumb because Hitler made a pact with the Japanese, which was called the Axis. Remember the Axis? Who was the third member of the Axis? Italy, Mussolini, yeah, whom they hung upside down, which he deserved. Yeah, the fascists. Well, so now we have to move to the ghetto, so we thought. But fortunately, we had shared a compartment with a very nice Japanese gentleman whose name was Dr. Manabe. And Dr. Manabe said to my mother, "Here is my business card. If you get to Shanghai and something isn't right, let me help you. Give me a call." Well, this was the time that my mother should give him a call. And she did. And Dr. Manabe, who was Japanese, did not listen to his superiors. He gave my mother an exemption So we didn't have to go to the ghetto at all. We could stay where we were. That was a major chance Dr. Manabe did. He violated the orders of his superiors in the name of conscience. You see, here is why I cannot generalize that everybody was evil during the Holocaust who was not Jewish. That's not true. In my own life, at least 4 men helped me, and only with their help did I survive. So there is no such thing as collective guilt. Guilt is an individual thing. Now, so I could remain in the same public school that I went, which was known as the Thomas Hanbury School for Boys. There was also a Thomas Hanbury School. Thomas Hanbury was a famous British professor. They asked the school, they named the school after him. But when the Japanese occupied them, they immediately confined the British citizens in Shanghai to detention centers, which means prisons. They imprisoned them. Also, our classes in Shanghai were no longer taught by Englishmen or English women. They were now taught by neutrals, who were hired from the Philippines, from all kinds of different places, some from Vichy, France, and it was at this time that they beat the hell out of me in school, because these were mostly pupils whose parents were allies of the Nazis, obviously. So they beat the hell out of me with a bamboo cane. There was one boy, we were now about 16 years old, 16, 17 we were now. There was one young boy who was White Russian, which meant he was running away from the communists, not the Nazis, or both. And all these pupils poked him with a whip and said, beat him, meaning me. He should beat me. And he crossed his arms and said, I will not beat him. This led to a lifelong friendship that I made in Shanghai. This wonderful young man who would refuse to beat me, that took great courage. And now my mother got another exemption. 1944. And even the most horrible year of World War II, 1945, the last year of the war. It was also the most horrible. It was in that year that President Truman, the successor of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, dropped 2 atom bombs, one on Hiroshima and the other on Nagasaki. And several millions died as a result of this. But the radiation reached as far as Shanghai, which was very close. And there were constant earthquakes. And in the meantime, the American B-29s bombed the hell out of us. So several of my fellow pupils died because they were hit with bombs. So life became hell. But Rusty and I, we stuck together. My poor mother had another nervous breakdown during those terrible days. And then I remember it like it was yesterday. Rusty lived across the street from me with a mother who was a fortune teller. And he said, "Hitler is dead." That was the day on April 20th, April 30th, when Hitler committed suicide. Thank goodness. With his mistress, Eva Braun, who took poison. And she also died. Well, this was great news, of course, for the Jews of Shanghai, because at least 7,000 Jews had fled to Shanghai. And then the war was over. And Rusty and I look at each other and say, what are we going to do now? Because both of us were alone at the age of 16, 17. He had a mother, but she was a little daft, a fortune teller. And my parents had also managed to leave Prague, but they took the long route and had to make a long stop in Singapore before the Chinese would let them in. So now comes a part of this lecture which I would say is mildly R-rated. Does anyone object to this R-rated part?
It's a college, they can take it.
How about that? You got a great professor there. She allows me to do everything. Okay. Well, I said mildly. Rusty and I both believed that there was no way that we could get out of this mess alive. The B-29s, the earthquakes, the lava, the radiation burns from the sun, which was now larger than ever. We didn't even recognize it. The sun was a huge red ball and burnt everybody's skin who exposed it. And Rusty and I looked at each other and we agreed on one thing. We had to do one more thing before we would die. We were 100% sure that we would die. Now, what do you think that was? Well, you know, this is a midterm test.
Sex.
On your feet. Who said that word? What? He doesn't want to get up.
I'm already up.
You're right. He deserves loud applause. That's good. Absolutely right. The word was sex. In other words, we needed to get laid, so to speak. Isn't that sort of a common word about it? Or is it vulgar? Okay. Well, but there was a major obstacle to this. I was enrolled in the Hanbury School for boys, no girls. The girls' school was next door to it, but there were barbed wires around it. And the boys who went wild to go on dates were not allowed to date the girls. Why? I have no idea. Especially in Shanghai, which was a wide open city. But the Japanese wanted to show how tough they were and how strict they were. It wasn't because they disapproved of sex, because they raped a lot of people while they were there. But in this case, they were strict because there were a bunch of lousy foreigners, as they called us. So there was only one thing to do in Shanghai if you wanted to have sex. It's going to get worse. And what do you think that was?
Prostitute.
What?
Geishas.
That's Japanese.
You said the word, not me. What?
Oh, I said prostitutes. Hookers, you know.
You are terrific. Give this courageous young woman another hand, please. You're absolutely right. That's right. There was a house of assignation, or whatever you want to call it. We can just call it a brothel or a whorehouse. About a mile away from the school. Why that geography existed is beyond me. And we had one pupil in that class who was a very nice guy. I remember him to this day. His name was Sarkari. He was from India. And he said to me, Johnny, which is what they called me, John D., you're writing pretty good poetry, but how can you write poetry without having had sex? And I looked at him and said, I don't know. I just write poetry. In those days, I was an admirer of Dylan Thomas. Remember that great poem? Rage, rage against the dying of the light. So wonderful. You, Father, on that great height. Rage against the dying of the light. That's a great poem. Well, so I admired poetry. So Sakari said, look, I know you don't have any money to spend on this. Let me see whether I can get you a discount. And then Sakari adds, I know the madam. Maybe she'll give you a break. So here, can you possibly visualize what now happens? Rusty and I are the advance guard here. It's about a half a mile that we have to walk. Sakari has gone ahead to make a deal with the madam, and then the whole class wanted to make a contribution financially. So there are all kinds of pennies and American nickels. Mind you, the war is over already, right? American nickels, even dimes that we picked up from the little road that led to that place. And then we arrived there. But Sakari sort of waves me away, so something has obviously gone wrong. And he came back and said to me, Johnny, the madam wouldn't give you a discount, but she has done something else for you. She'll give you 1 hour, half an hour for conversation, so you learn something. The other half hour is for sex. Now, this was sort of programmatic. You know, the pupils always called me the last romantic of the 20th century. I wanted romance, much more than sex. You know, the two are not necessarily connected. So I developed some doubts, but we've gone too far now to back out. So Rusty and I are the first to reach the place. It was one of the very few high buildings in Shanghai. You have to take a spiral staircase. See what that is? A spiral staircase to get to the top. And on the top of the spiral staircase were the rooms in which the ladies of the night do their business. And this was all very official. Rusty and I were permitted to climb up half the staircase. And there, the woman would come out of the room and introduce herself. This was all very formal. Which was the Chinese way. We had to learn this. And we climbed up the stairs, and there was a woman who introduced herself in Chinese, and her name was, translated, the Golden Dragon. Now mind you the cultural differences here. Because in the West, in the Western world, the dragon is feared. And gold collapsed on the stock market the other day. But it's still cherished, right? So the golden dragon. The problem was, when she appeared, Rusty and I looked at each other because she weighed at least 350 pounds. Well, they used to say in Shanghai, fat, very good. Fat is good too for Chinese women in Shanghai. The fatter, the better.
Excuse me, Professor?
Yes.
We are just about out of time. However, good news, Professor Stoessinger has agreed to continue his talk for all those who are interested to stick around. MD 303.